Okay, let's go. Everybody ready? Thank you all for joining us. I'm Charlotte Brody, the Vice President for Occupational Environmental Health for the Blue-Green Alliance. It's my job to welcome you and to thank you all for coming and to tell you that this webinar will be recorded and sent to all registrants. There's going to be plenty of time for Q&A, so please put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. Let me tell you a little bit about our three speakers. Jeff Hurley is the State Initiatives Manager for the Blue-Green Alliance and is based in Chicago, Illinois. Jeff leads policy development and implementation for the Building Clean program, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, and advances state-level policy opportunities in targeted states. Prior to joining BGA, Jeff worked at the National Conference of State Legislators, where, as the Director of State Federal Affairs, he managed NCSL's legislative agenda and coordinated the association's state-local fiscal relations. Miriam Zook is a partner of Groundworks Consulting, a practice that advances health equity, climate resilience, and shared prosperity through research, facilitation, and strategic support. Miriam has been advancing environmental and housing justice through research and policy for over 20 years. She was the co-founder and inaugural director of the Urban Displacement Project, a research and action lab at the University of California at Berkeley, and is widely published on the issues of neighborhood change, gentrification, displacement, and equitable and sustainable development. And Kevin Hall. Kevin is the Assistant Director for Architecture and Construction Services in the Multifamily Financing Department of the Illinois Housing Development Authority. He leads a team that is responsible for maintaining and administering the architecture and construction standards that are used in the selection and oversight of development teams receiving funding resources through IHDA. Prior to this position, Kevin was the Director of Planning, Design, and Engineering for the Chicago Housing Authority, which oversees public housing in the city of Chicago. He was responsible for managing the planning and design of projects, including the CHA's capital improvement program worth more than $300 million. It's a great lineup. So let's get to it. Next slide, please, Michaela. I want to just tell you a little bit about the Blue-Green Alliance. This is our, the Blue-Green Alliance Foundation. This is our mission. And next slide. And this is the front of our website that has the specific mission of the Building Clean program of the Blue-Green Alliance Foundation, improving efficiency, health, and equity in housing and creating good jobs. So let me just take one more paragraph to state the obvious. Dismantling 400 years of the walls and sinkholes of racism is really hard. Improving affordable housing so it is safer and healthier for the construction crews and the people who will live there, more energy efficient and more accessible to people of color, tears down a few bricks and fills in a few holes. It qualifies as a big deal. And with that, let me turn it over to Jeff Hurley.
Thank you, Charlotte. And thank you. I want to echo Charlotte's comments about thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We are very pleased to for the release of our QAP report / scorecard, which will be added to the chat below for folks who have not yet seen it. Before we dive into the intricacies of the scorecard, first I want to take a step back and just give a primer, if you will, on QAPs and the low-income housing tax credit known as LIHTC. On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see a simple but articulate graph that chart that was put together by the good folks at Energy Efficiency for All. So LIHTC, but before discussing QAPs, you have to dive into LIHTC a little bit. LIHTC was created in 1987 as part of a large and comprehensive federal tax reform plan and has helped finance 4 million affordable housing units over ever since, and is the nation's largest program at the production and preservation of affordable rental housing. Each year, the federal government allocates tax credits to states based off their population, and although there are some federal requirements to go along with it, income eligibility, affordability requirements, states are given broad authority to determine how to allocate these tax credits. Every jurisdiction has a QAP, although often they go by manuals, policies, application instructions, and each state usually has threshold requirements, mandates that a developer has to reach, but otherwise they are able to prioritize their allocation. So some states may prioritize assisting vulnerable populations, preserving current housing stock, or targeting energy efficiency and occupant health. Next slide, Michaela. So really the origins of the scorecard come from a few different areas. We at Building Clean felt there was a void that needed to be filled. Up until from about the mid-2000s to 2007, a group called Global Green did a QAP analysis on health, energy efficiency, and sustainability in state QAPs, basically a grading system, if you will. And in talking to fellow stakeholders and allies, we always kind of felt that was an area that we would like to continue, that there was, again, somewhat of a void there. That's not to say that there haven't been other reports released in recent years. Again, the Energy Efficiency for All released a fantastic report on state strategies for energy and water conservation in recent years. But we wanted to kind of have our own twist on this analysis. I think we consider, when we consider racial disparities in QAPs, that's an area that's underrepresented, and we wanted to highlight that and to kind of dig a little bit deeper there. In terms of our process for the scorecard, we developed our criteria and methodology last year, then did comprehensive research on all 50 states plus Washington, D.C., the cities of Chicago and New York. Shout out to Jonas Hadis for all his research on the project. And then reached out to all state housing finance agencies to ask for edits, comments, and we got feedback from over 30 states, which we then incorporated into our research. And just to, I know it's the report signifies it, but I want to mention that we essentially reviewed all QAPs up until the end of 2022. So I know that a number of states have either drafted or finalized their QAPs over the past 6 months, but those are not included in this report. Next slide, please. So there's numerous challenges in putting this project together. And then I'll just go into a few of them here. One of the primary issues was weighing and considering requirements versus incentives versus provisions that are just encouraged or mentioned in QAPs. So, for example, if a state can require low VOC sealants, or oftentimes they'll just encourage the use of it. For our scoring measures, we decided to weigh if something is required, they would get double the points of incentives, and if it's just mentioned or encouraged, then a state QAP would not get credit for that policy. One of the other more challenging aspects was comparing third-party building certifications. I think there's about 30 green building certifications in use at the moment. No two certainly are alike. Some focus on health, others energy efficiency, others resiliency. So like, for example, Enterprise requires low VOC coatings and non-interior paint, but LEED and NGBS, the National Green Building Standards, only incentivize them. Enterprise requires no added formaldehyde for composite wood products. The other two only incentivize again. So this was certainly a challenge. We after much contemplation, decided just to not differentiate green building certifications, just essentially judge them equally, even though that was, there's probably some that we prefer more than others, but kind of differentiating them and breaking them off into like tiered systems would be way too arduous and probably unproductive. And then just for this, I guess I mentioned on the slide, the part on the right is the old methodology for that global green put together. And we also decided to incorporate both new construction and rehabilitation and focus primarily on the 9% low-income housing tax credits, which are considered the competitive tax credits. Next slide, please. So kind of getting into the meat and potatoes here, the first section that we look at is healthy building practices. So there's several different ways we both graded and states incorporated these practices into their QAPs. If a state required a green building certification for both new construction and rehabilitation, they scored quite highly. There's other avenues that states can go down. Maryland, for example, incentivizes green building certifications, but they also require green labeled carpeting, low VOC paint and sealants, and they ban formaldehyde from composite wood products. So obviously they score highly as well. We found that unfortunately there's not many eco labels mentioned in QAPs besides the green label plus for carpeting. But one kind of outlier there was that Washington having their state standard, the Evergreen Sustainable Development Standards. They have really a detailed provisions related to healthy building practices and cite several eco labels, excuse me. So we were certainly a big fan of that. Next slide, please. So seeing as though green building certifications are quite prominent in our research, it'd probably be worthwhile breaking this out a little bit. There are 35 states who require or incentivize green building certifications. This is up by several states over the past 5 years. But more importantly, the number of states who have required green building certifications has doubled over the past 5 years, which we are a fan of. There are we've cited states like Illinois. There's a number of states, again, like Illinois, which doesn't require a green building certification, but they mandate the mandates within enterprise green communities. So that particularly those that reference healthy building materials and energy efficiency. So we gave them a score that they have a green building certification. 32 states have EGC, 28 have LEED, and 25 have NGBS, the National Green Building Standard, from our research. Next, and just for this chart here, I've probably mentioned the states in green require green building certifications, and those in yellow only incentivize them. Next slide, please. So energy efficiency. This is in terms of the methodology was perhaps the most challenging. We settled on focusing on outcomes instead of process for our criteria. So this means practices such as physical needs assessments, utility coordination, utility allowances, renewable energy provisions were not scored. Instead, for new construction, we relied on, as a foundation, Energy Star certification. Now, one of the challenges there are many green building certifications incorporate Energy Star standard into their certifications, like EGC, LEED, Earthcraft, whereas I believe NGBS only incentivizes it. So again, that kind of goes to the difficulties and subjective nature of the project. For rehabilitation, again, focusing on outcomes and ideally verification, we figured that energy reduction was the primary method in the kind of the prominent way that states could achieve the score. So so states with a HERS index where energy efficiency is measured were graded positively. And then again, there's also questions for many green building certifications have these same standards. So we, in this circumstance, we judge them the same. Next slide, please. So labor standards and local sourcing, very important to both Building Clean and the Blue Green Alliance, but we decided not to score them in the scorecard, and this was for several reasons. First, there's really too many uncertainties in how labor standards are determined and enforced, particularly at the local and municipal levels. There's also the issue that oftentimes LIHTC projects are coupled with other funding streams like HUD's a home investment partnership program, which I think triggers prevailing wage requirements if 12 or more units are being developed. We also, I think there's only a handful of states that mention, so no states mention prevailing wages, only a handful cite apprenticeship training. I think those are Washington, D.C., Illinois, and Chicago. And only a handful, again, have any local or regional sourcing provisions. Then we are strong advocates of local sourcing. We believe this can boost the local economy, supports domestic manufacturing, and lowers greenhouse gas emissions from the reduced transportation. Again, from what Charlotte mentioned earlier, BGA, just a quick plug, BGA's Building Clean website is a tool to find where building products are made, where U.S. manufacturers are, and those manufacturers that are union manufacturers. So again, for any questions, I'd urge you to go to www.buildingclean.org and to plug. And finally, in this, for this category, we aim to do a bigger project analyzing labor standard laws for affordable housing and multifamily housing in the near future. So if you want to be involved or have any questions on that, please, I urge you to reach out to me. Next slide. So the final section that we scored, racial equity. I won't want to dive in too deep here as Miriam Zook will speak next on this project, on this section. I just want to make clear that the criteria that was developed here was done with through outreach with outside groups, affordable housing organizations, tenant groups, developers who have a specific interest in racial equity. We're all involved in developing this criteria, which is really why I think it's fantastic in terms of its the detailed nature of its framework. Some of the good, the positive findings that we found. Many states have incentives for units for individuals who are considered extremely low income or very low income. There's a number of states have incentives for BIPOC owned or controlled developers and or define what a BIPOC owned and or controlled entity is. And the majority of states have amenities, policies for amenities and service coordination, health, wellness, economic development, financial services, home ownership, counseling. So those are all positive findings that we came across. Some areas that states need some work. We really didn't see much outreach and affirmative marketing. Only a handful of states have an appeals process for an applicant to provide mitigating information if they're denied housing. And in particular, the lack of information on data accountability and transparency is something that we'd love to see improved. The reporting of vacancies for disabled units, tenant demographics, reporting demographics on members of project teams was very much lacking, and I think it's going to be an area that we target in the near future. The next slide, please. Here's top 10 scores that we've seen. I'll point out at the bottom the overall grade. The average overall grade was a C. We, for the racial equity section, had a significant curve, and even despite this, no state scored an A. So I think for a lot of the states that did well in racial equity, first, awesome. Congratulations. But I still think there may be some opportunities for improvement, and we're really excited about that as well. And then next slide, please. And then just really quickly, what's next? We really hope to work with the folks on this call, state housing, finance agencies, stakeholders who are interested to strengthen QAPs. That's kind of the next stage of our project. And again, we're excited to work with folks who are interested in the same objectives that we are. I want to thank Gabby Davis, Michaela Bruner, Jonas Hadis for their tremendous and fantastic work on putting this report together. And finally, we have a lot of information and research that was not included in the report on specific language that states have in their QAP. So if anyone is interested in examples or on certain criteria, please feel free to reach out to me at your convenience. And with that, I will turn it over to Miriam.
Thanks, Jeff. Next slide, please. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Miriam Zook. I'm with Groundworks Consulting, and Jeff asked me to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the racial equity criteria for the QAP. So I'm going to give you a little background on how we developed it and a little taste for some of the criteria that we worked on. Next slide, please. So just to say that Jeff approached us maybe in 2021, early 2022, with this request to support Blue Green Alliance in the development of a framework to evaluate state QAP performance on racial equity criteria. And he approached us because of my personal involvement with the development of Chicago's racial equity impact assessment of their QAP, which came out in 2021. And I'll give you a little bit more information about that process, but really seeing that as precedent that this project could build upon, and supporting Blue Green Alliance Foundation as this is sort of a new avenue for their work, and to learn from that experience. So next slide, please. So this was the definitions for racial equity that we were using that really come from Race Forward, talking about racial equity as both a process and an outcome. It's about minimizing or eliminating racial disparities and improving outcomes for everyone. This intentional practice of changing policies, practices, systems, and structures was really, and certainly centering the voice of marginalized groups in decision-making process. That's sort of the backdrop of how we thought about what are the different ways that the LIHTC and QAPs can intersect with racial equity goals and outcomes. Next slide, please. So when we started working with the Blue Green Alliance, we first went about, really doing a deep dive and looking at the approach that the Chicago Racial Equity Impact Assessment went about, and using a lot of that research that I was part of back when I was at Enterprise Community Partners in Chicago, and then broadening the look and doing a bunch of research and stakeholder outreach. And then finally, we created an advisory committee to help us really think about what are all the different ways and potential for influencing LIHTC. And they provided a ton of input and also did a review of scoring criteria and weighting. Next slide. So the Chicago's Racial Equity Impact Assessment actually has sort of a longer trajectory, and great, thank you for dropping that link in there. So the work really started years and years ago when activists and researchers worked on the cost of segregation report in Chicago, and the Commissioner of Housing at the Department of Housing in Chicago. When she came in, she had worked on the cost of segregation report and had been involved with this work with Chicago United for Equity that used this racial equity impact assessment framework, said, let's do this. This is a moment where we can influence LIHTC through the QAP process. So let's do this racial equity impact assessment on the QAP, which was the first of its kind in the country. And this process is really it's a lot about outreach and engagement. And so we engaged all sorts of different sectors to try to understand how does LIHTC in the city, because the city of Chicago has its own QAP, how does it benefit, who does it benefit, and who is burdened by the existing system? And then what are some measures that can influence those outcomes that could shift the balance in Chicago. Next slide, please. So from that process, we developed these 5 different categories of looking at who's benefits and who is burdened, and then with a long set of recommendations within there that has significantly influenced LIHTC developments in the Chicago region. And I'm going to go into more detail on these in a minute, but I just wanted to kind of give you a glimpse of what were some of those categories that we came up with when we were working in Chicago. And that was sort of the precedent and building blocks for this process. Next slide, please. So, that was a very Chicago specific experience. Obviously, it might be different from other parts of the country, and there are a lot of similarities as well. So we knew that, we couldn't just use directly the work that we did in Chicago. We needed to sort of build upon it. And so we first started a process of stakeholder outreach. We did 21 different exploratory interviews to really try to get a better sense of how are different sectors seeing the intersections of LIHTC with racial equity. What are sort of the key issues and possibilities? Where are we seeing some best practices around the state? And we did a snowball set of interviews to really ground us in what is the landscape of work on this across the country. We did a webinar that was open to the public to broaden that outreach in 2022. And then based on all of that, we formed a 9-person advisory committee that represented folks from the development community, from advocacy and tenant legal aids, as well as folks into the intermediary and finance. So we have more expertise in the intermediary and finance perspectives. We also tried to have geographic coverage and racial representation in that committee. Next slide, please. So based on all of that work with the committee, with that research, we developed these 6 overarching categories, and I'll give some examples of each of these in the following slides. We looked at access, who are the developers, how is community engaged, what kind of amenities and services are offered, location, and data accountability and transparency. And through this, we would develop sort of best practices and criteria by looking at some QAPs and examples of them and other best practices out in sort of different development contexts. And then we would go back to the committee and talk about the findings. We had them do a ranking about which categories they felt had greatest impact on racial equity. And then we iterated from there. Next slide, please. So to give sort of highlight of these 6 different categories, access was sort of the largest category that we looked at. We're thinking about, who is able to access the benefits of LIHTC developments and how are they meeting the needs of BIPOC populations. And so the 4 different categories within the access one that we looked at and developed criteria had to do with the size of the units, like what types of family sizes and designs. So who, mobility issues specifically are able to access these types of units. The depth of the affordability and really thinking about how does that compare with the income of different BIPOC populations. So how is it meeting that need? Outreach and affirmative marketing. How do we make sure that BIPOC populations learn about and are really able to access this resource? And then finally, tenant screening. So who is kept out of LIHTC developments? I should also mention, thinking about what when discussing how we develop these, we learned through the process that a lot of the criteria that we were developing might not be contained within the QAP per se, but different guidelines and other policies. And so Really want to commend Blue Green Alliance for their outreach process there, where they went to each HFA, asked them to review it, and then if some of these policies existed in other areas, to provide that resource so we could include that within the evaluation. And here's just an example of the Massachusetts affirmative fair housing marketing, and just one example of it, because they have very specific language in there about making sure that the language of outreach materials matches the language of groups in the different regions that they're doing outreach in. So we saw a lot of really great examples in the research of where we saw this happening. Next slide, please. Something that has caught really grown in attention and seeing lots of practice in this, especially since 2020, is really about from the professional side of things, who are the developers and service providers that are benefiting from the LIHTC system. And we know, that a lot of the development community is overrepresented of white populations instead of the representation of the people that it tends to serve. And so looking at some of the emerging best practices within that arena to make sure that BIPOC developers also benefit from the system. These are 6 of the categories of the criteria that we included there, which include, criteria about incentives or set-asides for making sure that BIPOC-owned or controlled developers with lived experience are part of the teams. And we certainly saw in the Chicago QAP experience that over half of their new developments are with BIPOC-owned development teams. And then you can see down, and what we found in the research is that this first one, at least in the newer QAPs, there is a lot of growing uptake of this practice within QAPs, which is really exciting. Next slide, please. From the community engagement side of things, really thinking about, making sure that those most impacted are part of identifying and designing the solutions. We looked at different criteria about really defining who are the community-based organizations and including definitions of those communities impacted by housing disparities in the QAPs, making sure that there are tools for effective engagement and partnerships and guidelines about what effective community engagement should look like, and just really making sure that proposals are responsive to community needs and input. As you can see, there's much left to be desired in this arena across the state. Next slide, please. Within the amenities and services, knowing that housing is a necessary but insufficient tool to achieve household goals and make sure that we are advancing racial, especially health equity outcomes. A couple of the different criteria that we used here is about making sure that QAPs require submission of services and amenity plans, providing opportunities for asset building and home ownership resources, and really making sure that there's clear guidance and a requirement for HFAs to review tenant engagement plans to make sure that tenants are continually engaged and are making sure that any amenities and services really meet the needs of the tenants. Next slide. Something that has received a ton of attention, especially as folks think about racial equity and segregation, is about the location and siting of LIHTC. And we know location matters for outcomes, and disproportionately LIHTC developments have been sited in disinvested, low-cost neighborhoods with few resources. So this was probably one of the more challenging criteria to develop, both because there's that balance between wanting to make sure that low-income households have access to opportunity, but making sure that we're not, creating new forms of redlining. And so here we tried to balance those two, as both of making sure that HFAs are talking about opportunity, but also making sure that it's sort of not overly weighted in any one direction. And also making sure that developments are cited away from environmental environmental health risks or that there are remediation plans. Next slide. Finally, the data accountability and transparency. There's a severe lack of information, right, about like who's applying, who lives in high-tech developments. This is something we learned when we were working on the Chicago REIA, is just getting information about who currently lives and the demographics of tenants was really difficult. Demographics of development teams, it was not practically non-existent, but it's certainly an emerging information that is both being collected and being shared. And just having more up-to-date and regular information about developments and units and vacancies, et cetera, is really something that we know that the advocacy world really clamors for. So that is it for my part. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Hall.
Great, thanks, Miriam. As mentioned before, I work at the Illinois Housing Development Authority, and we are one of two housing finance authorities for the state of Illinois, the other one being the city of Chicago. So between the two of us, we are allocated the LIHTC credits, and we work on through our respective QAPs issuing or allocating those credits. So today, what I want to do is I want to focus on two areas in IDA's QAP: sustainability and equity, both of which are important policy initiatives of the authority. And especially in this time of climate change and rising inequalities, it's more important than ever to incentivize the development of affordable housing that incorporates sustainability and equity into our deals. So as I focus on, and you can go to the next slide, thank you. So what I wanted to do is kind of give you a really high level overview of the evolution of both sustainability and equity as they're included in the QAP. We are in the midst of writing the next QAP for the 2024-2025 cycle. And I will do a plug in if anybody is in the state of Illinois on this call, and I would encourage you to please look at the QAP when it comes out for public comment in late August. We will be working with a local organization called the Illinois Housing Council, and they will be hosting some webinars on and we'll be going over the changes there. So we really encourage people to give some comments on these. We spent a lot of time on the QAP, and then also associated, I should mention, is that we're updating our design, construction, and regulatory requirements, which have probably really not substantially been updated in about 10 to 15 years. So we're going to have both of those out for public comment, and we're looking forward to getting some good comments. So just a little bit of a plug there before I jump into sustainability. Sustainability has always been an important part of the QAP, but it really took on more of a heightened role, I would say, in the 2022-2023 QAP, where prior to that, we had it incorporated, but the baseline requirements for sustainability were really based on an IDA developed standard, and also had limited incentives for additional points to earn through the QAP. And those incentives were limited to certification through really only 3 green building programs: the Enterprise Green Communities, United States Green Building Council, Leadership in Environmental and Energy and Environmental Design, or LEED, and then the National Green Building Standard. So that's kind of where we started prior to 2022, 2023. During the 2022-2023 QAP, which is our current one, we worked on significantly enhancing the requirements and the incentives for sustainability. So this is the first time you'll see that we adopted EGC's mandatory requirements, and they basically replaced our own sustainability requirements, because we believe that EGC was, first of all, it's geared toward housing. It's a accepted standard, and instead of developing our own, we decided to use an accepted standard that will evolve over time, and we'll continue to work with that. So that's right now, and going forward, it will not change. That is our required standard for all projects and there's one exception in the new QAP that I'll get to in a minute. But all projects have to abide by those mandatory. Then beyond that, to incentivize a higher level of sustainability, we have in the 2022-23 QAP added more to it than just the three programs that I mentioned earlier. So to those three I mentioned before, we added the National Green Building Standard, NGBS, International Living Future Institute, ILFI, and then the Passive House Institute, US or FIAS, to that list of programs that you can achieve certification for in order to get some more points on your application. So as I mentioned, we're working on the 2024-2025 QAP. We're looking really to, I would call it a refinement, and there is one important enhancement to the level of incentives for certification. So again, like I said earlier, the baseline requirement stays the same, EGC mandatory. That's not going to change. The only thing that we are, and this is all still being proposed, so it's not finalized and won't be really finalized until September, is that we've gotten a lot of feedback on projects that we would deem as minor rehabilitation, and we've worked with EGC on this. EGC is not really designed to deal with projects of a minor rehab nature. So we're looking at not requiring EGC mandatory for those minor. We'll still include it for new construction, substantial rehabilitation, moderate rehabilitation, but not minor rehabilitation. So that's something that we've gotten a lot of feedback from developers where if they're not doing work on the exterior enclosure, building systems, it's really hard to meet some of the EGC mandatory requirements. So that's something we're looking at as a change in the requirement. And the other part of it, the incentives we're trying to broaden the incentives, and kind of, this is where I think the refinement comes about. We're looking at and really more codifying that there's 3 different levels of certification where you get progressively higher points. So we have the basic level with all of these programs that I mentioned, all 5 of them. And then we have an advanced level where you get a little more credit for those at a higher level, for instance, let's say LEED Platinum. And then the highest level we're really trying to incentivize net zero energy certification, again, through all the 5 programs. The one I think really important add, and what I would call an enhancement that we've made, we've been talking to folks at the United States Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the United States Department of Energy, DOE, and we are proposing adoption of the Zero Energy Ready Home program. The benefit here is that there are no costs associated with the program because they're administered through those 2 different federal departments, agencies. So that's kind of we're hoping that this is maybe more of an entry level for some developers who find it challenging to go after certification with some of the other green building programs. And then the other thing that this is a good alignment with is that the ZERH program is a requirement for energy efficiency tax credits that are included in the Inflation Reduction Act. So another thing to incentivize people going after those credits. We believe adding this program will increase, hopefully support that effort as well. So that's kind of the world that we're trying to incentivize within sustainability. Next slide, please. So I want to touch briefly on equity and what we're doing here, what we have today, and then how we're refining the policy. So this has the focus on equity, and particularly in encouraging projects which include participants that are led by or with businesses led by Black, Indigenous, or people of color, or BIPOC, has been in our QAP for a number of years. But in 2022, 2023, I think that's a significant time where we really looked closely at enhancing it. really better defining what the requirements are to gain more points to incentivize the more inclusion of BIPOC-led entities. So this slide, again, like the last slide, kind of shows you, and I should have mentioned anything in red is really kind of, I was trying to highlight what the change is. So the actual incentives, there's not a lot of change you can see, and I'll talk on the one change that's about scoring, but let me just give you a brief highlight about how we approach BIPOC participation. So first of all, we define it by whether it's for-profit, BIPOC-led, and that means that it's a business that includes an MBE certification. And in the state of Illinois, there's a number of places that entities can get that certification. And then there's two levels in the nonprofit area. So we have nonprofit BIPOC-led, and that's at the leadership level, and that's defined as an organization with a minimum of 35% of leadership that is BIPOC, or nonprofit BIPOC governed. And that the definition there is as an organization whose board chair and a minimum of 30% of all voting members is BIPOC, or whose board composition is 40% BIPOC. I know it's a lot to throw on you guys. It's all in the QAP. You can go on our website and there's a lot more detail there. But just to give you an idea, of how we organize the different levels. And then within the BIPOC, how the organization is organized, we then look at, as far as credits are allocated, or is whether the BIPOC is a sponsor and they have a majority stake, whether they're a co-sponsor and have a minority stake, and we have two levels of credits there, or the lowest level of credits would really be whether they are an M, W, or D participant. And that means really the AOR, architect of record, general contractor, or property manager. So that is all what we have now. What we've been hearing and seeing as we look at data from projects that were awarded during this period, the 2022-2023 QAP, is that most of the projects had nonprofit BIPOC-led organizations. And so we're working, we realize we need to figure out a way to encourage for-profit BIPOC-led organizations, businesses. And so we're working on doing that through kind of a change to our scoring system, and trying to give a little more points to that. We don't want to, it's a bit of a balancing act, because we don't obviously want to preclude the nonprofit organizations, but we do want to get more participation for the for-profit businesses that we want to encourage. The last thing that I'll mention is that we do have, and I don't have a slide on this, but I think it's an interesting program called NextGen, and it's basically a mentorship program for BIPOC organizations. And because we know I think everybody knows it takes time to get these entities going. So what that NextGen program does is it provides not only financial support to build these entities, whether it's an architect, whether it's a developer, whoever it is, but also some technical assistance. And there's an application round and they can apply. And the hope is that we build these entities and then they can become part of the project deals in the future. So with that, I think, like I said, please weigh in if you want to, and especially if you're in Illinois, on our QAP and our requirements that are coming out in late August. But with that, I will wrap up my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to all three of the presenters. I have a couple of questions in the Q&A and encourage people to add more. The first one, I think, Jeff, is for you, from Peter Lawrence. Did BGAF separate out new construction LIHTC, especially the 9% new construction, when evaluation LIHTC property citing provisions in QAPs? I still think I read that wrong, but you understand the question.
Sure. Yes. So for evaluating the criteria in the racial equity section, we we're more lenient, and in terms of some of those, I think, challenges I mentioned for the scorecard in terms of requirements, incentives, and focusing on the 9% competitive tax credits. For racial equity, we scored and accepted state criteria if it was mentioned and referenced in the QAP. So kind of those caveats I mentioned previously, those were largely for the other sections, healthy building practices and energy efficiency.
Great. Kevin, this one's for you. You read it, yes? In Illinois,
Yes.
how do you prioritize green building and energy efficiency standards with increased development costs, particularly with the need for more affordable housing? Yeah, you've
Go
heard
ahead,
this
go ahead,
one
Sarah.
before. Yeah.
That is quite a question. It's a great question. And I will say that we grapple with this every single day, and especially in the last 2 or 3 years where we saw price, the construction cost has just been like a roller coaster over the last 3 years. It's stabilized a little, so that's good. As a plug, and probably hopefully a lot of people on this call have read it was a really great New York Times article called The Everything Bagel. And it was about how building affordable housing is, we talk about this a lot at IDA, where we just keep stacking different requirements on these deals, which is really making it challenging for developers to put one together. So, with that said, we definitely believe that sustainability and in particular energy efficiency standards are incredibly important. We need to encourage those and incentivize those. I mentioned but with that said, there are certain projects, certain scopes of projects that we feel we need to relax a little. And I mentioned the issue of more of a minor rehab, where we have developers coming in and they're recapitalizing a project, and maybe they're only touching one element. Maybe they're replacing, we had a project recently where they were just replacing the heating and cooling units. They're called magic packs in this case. And that's it. They're not touching the exterior envelope. So they literally can't meet some of the EGC requirements. So what we do with them, we still encourage them to pick the most efficient unit when they buy a new one. What I'll say is that, we definitely look at each project individually. We have our requirements, but no two projects are alike. We have to look at each one, and I think vast majority of developers that we work with want to do the right thing. They know that if they're building in energy efficiency, it may cost a little more upfront, but they're going to reap those rewards in lower operational costs. The other thing that I think is really helpful, it's helpful to us and helpful to developers, in our during the application period, as a part of our property needs assessment, the P&A that we require an ASHRAE level 2 energy audit, which what that can do is that can allow the developer to understand some of the low-hanging fruit they can do to increase their energy efficiency, maybe at little cost, and in some cases no cost if they can go get a grant for some of those things. So it's a great question. I will say, and a long answer probably says this, there's no easy answer, but I still think we have to encourage this, and we just have to help our developers find the best way and the most efficient way to incorporate it, finding other resources beyond what we can provide, things like that. So it's something that will continue to evolve. Terrific,
thank you. We have 3 minutes and 3 questions, so only 60 seconds for each one. Miriam, was there consideration of mental health assistance in coordination with tenants, with service providers and racial equity?
Yes, well, it's in the amenities and services section, and it's not specific, it doesn't specify all the different services, but that would be encompassed within that section, in the first criteria in that section.
Thank you. This is from Carrie Williams. We have received feedback that checking boxes and/or attesting to one's BIPOC identity is demeaning and places a burden on BIPOC entities that white entities do not have. Do any HFAs have creative ideas of how to achieve some kind of certification of BIPOC identity without including this extra burden and or performative box checking practice? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I'll just say really quickly that it's a very fair question. I do know that I don't know if I can reference any states in particular, but I know like in Minnesota, there's been some feedback that the BIPOC phrase or terminology is come under resistance from some folks. I don't know. I can't recall off the top of my head if there what the resolution was there, but yeah, I can certainly do some digging and see if I can come up with anything and share it with you, Carrie.
Great. 1 minute. Did you consider scoring criteria to promote BIPOC woman-owned and led for-profit small businesses? If not, why not?
I believe that's also encompassed within that BIPOC developers and service providers. It doesn't specify just nonprofit.
I think that's right. And then finally, 30 seconds. What has been the initial response by HFAs to the QAP report and their overall grade? I think, Jeff, that has to be for you.
Sure. I think it's overall receptive. I think there's some questions on, I think I'd be the first to admit that the criteria methodology is subjective in nature, which there's no one tried and true way to, I think, put together the report that we did. But yeah, I think overall, we just want to welcome any insight, recommendations that folks have, and look forward to the opportunity to collaborate with both HFAs and other folks interested in energy efficiency, healthy building, and racial equity.
Amen. So I hope everyone will join me in thanking these great speakers. Again, the recording will be available tomorrow, and thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.